I'm Air Force Major Paul Max Moga from Air Combat Command's 1st Fighter Wing, and I fly the world's most advanced combat fighter, the F-22 Raptor. As the host of Showdown Air Combat, I'm going to take you to a place few people have ever been before. Right into the cockpit as we relive some of the most compelling dogfights of all time. In fact, I'll be flying in a chase plane to describe the action as we reconstruct these epic duels with restored versions of the classic warbirds that fought them. We'll also analyze the remarkable technical features, examine the groundbreaking tactics, and get to know the extraordinary pilots who flew these planes on the original missions. It will be an incredible journey, and I'm going to be your guide every step of the way. Welcome to Showdown Air Combat.
U.S. aircraft fall like rocks around the Japanese fleet at Midway. So far, not one of the attacking planes has made it past the swarm of defending Zeros. But despite the carnage, a U.S. Navy pilot named John Thach leads a group of F4F Wildcats into the meat grinder. They employ a new tactic, one that Thach himself invents to even the odds with the deadly Japanese fighters. Will the Thach weave work in battle, or will Thach and his Wildcats get smoked by the Zeros?
The planes and their pilots are critically important to the outcome of a dogfight, but their tactics are just as essential. The F-22 Raptor I fly is literally rewriting the book on aerial tactics. That's because its capabilities are so revolutionary that it's made most of the tactics that have been tried and tested since the birth of air combat in World War I basically obsolete. But keep in mind that sound tactics can also allow a less capable aircraft to fight on the same level as a superior plane. That was the situation in the opening months of World War II. The Japanese Zero was clearly superior in most respects to the U.S. Navy's F4F Wildcat. And yet, a U.S. naval aviator named John Thach devised tactics he believed would allow the Wildcat to fight the Zero on far more equal terms. They were nicknamed the Thach Weave, and Thach himself would be the first to test them in a real dogfight during one of the most crucial battles in American history.
In late May of 1942, the strategic picture for the U.S. in the Pacific Theater is grim. Since the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor over 5 months before, they have made tremendous gains and appear to be invincible.
The Japanese had really expanded their empire almost to its widest extent. They had already captured most of Southeast Asia, and they were already in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea.
One of the biggest advantages Japanese forces have during the campaign is their superb Mitsubishi Zero fighter. Swift, agile, and hard-hitting, it is a powerful offensive platform, and perhaps the best carrier-borne fighter of its generation.
The Zero was highly maneuverable. It had a terrific rate of climb, and it also had phenomenal range. It had more than 3 times the range of their opponent.
That opponent is the U.S. Navy's Grumman F4F Wildcat.
The Wildcat was very rugged. It had armor plate, self-sealing fuel tanks. It wasn't quite the stellar performer that the Zero was. It had much shorter range, although it was pretty standard for most fighter aircraft of that time period to have the kind of range and combat radius that the Wildcat did. The Zero, in that sense, was quite exceptional in terms of its range capability.
So far in the Pacific War, the Zero has outperformed the Wildcat in almost every encounter between the two fighters. And the Japanese in general have been just as unstoppable. But Admiral Chester Nimitz and the U.S. Navy top brass have a plan to stop the Japanese steamroller. It centers on a tiny atoll about 1,500 miles from Hawaii called Midway. Because U.S. cryptologists have broken a top-secret Japanese naval code, the American High Command knows the Japanese are planning a major assault on the island.
The main significance of Midway for the Japanese was not so much the island itself, but the fact that because it's of strategic importance and so close to Hawaii, it's a target which the U.S. Could not ignore. They would be forced to come out and fight.
What the Japanese want most is to destroy the U.S. aircraft carriers that are at sea on maneuvers during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and as a result, escape destruction.
And after that, during the first 6 months of the Pacific War, it was really the U.S. carrier force that posed the only serious threat to the Japanese. And so they begin making a series of hit-and-run raids along the perimeter of the Japanese Empire, and it's a real thorn in the Japanese side. So Admiral Yamamoto, the head of the Japanese Imperial Combined Fleet, wants nothing better than to get rid of the American carriers.
In order to do so, the Japanese massed virtually their entire fleet, including 4 aircraft carriers. Against this powerful striking force, the U.S. Navy can only marshal 3 carriers and a few support vessels. In the meantime, U.S. naval aviators have been looking for ways to even the odds between the Zero and their Wildcat. One of them is Lieutenant Commander John "Jimmy" Thach.
Jimmy Thach had actually begun thinking about a more effective way of defensive formation flying from before Pearl Harbor. He did much of the groundwork pre-Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Throughout the early months of the war, Thach continues to analyze the enormous challenge posed by the Zero, trying to find a tactical solution to the technical shortcomings of the Wildcat.
Well, I think Jimmy Thach brought to the cockpit certainly a mind that looked to the capabilities of his enemy. He looked at the Japanese Zero, looked at the fighter planes that the enemy was going to bring to the table, and tried to figure out how best to defeat that enemy with the equipment that he had.
It was a combination of Thach's dogged determination and past flight experience that gave him an edge.
He received his wings in the late 1920s and really served in all different sorts of aircraft. He flew patrol planes, he had flown fighters, he had flown float planes, he'd been a test pilot, and that combined with the confidence he had and the aggressive spirit he had, that really was a good combination when he entered combat in World War II.
Thach brings all these qualities with him into the cockpit, and every one of them helps make him a better fighter pilot. But in a dogfight, the pilot's skill and tactics are only half the battle. The other half is the technical abilities of the airplanes. Now let's take a quick look at the plane that Jimmy Thach had to work with. The Grumman F4F-4 Wildcat has a wingspan of 38 feet and is 28 feet 9 inches long. Its Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engine generates 1,200 horsepower, giving it a top speed of 320 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 34,000 feet. Now let's see what Thach and his Wildcats are up against. The Mitsubishi Zero is 29 feet 9 inches long and has a span of a little over 39 feet. Its 14-cylinder radial engine develops about 1,000 horsepower, giving it a top speed of 331 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 33,000 feet. One factor that's both a strength and a weakness for the Zero is its weight, under 4,000 pounds empty. The Wildcat is over a ton heavier. The Zero's slight build helps make it extremely maneuverable, but this less robust structure also makes it more vulnerable to enemy fire. To get a better idea of what these planes are really like, let's take a closer look.
So, here we are again, with the Grumman F4F Wildcat and the Japanese Zero. But this time, the focus will be a little different. The specific technical features are still important, but even more so is how the pilots use those features to gain the advantage in combat.
Among the main factors that give the Zero drivers an edge over the Wildcat is the rate of climb, rate of turn, and overall gun power.
It had 2 7.7 millimeter machine guns over the engine cowling, but it also had 2 20 millimeter cannon in the wings.
Qualities like these make the Zero extremely dangerous offensively, something that's easy to see when you actually sit in the plane's cockpit.
So, you know, as much as I hate to admit it,
because the Japanese were our enemies in the Pacific during World War II, I can really now understand why we faced such a challenge with this aircraft, because it is such a well-designed and built offensive weapon. So if I were a Zero pilot in World War II, I can tell you that knowing that I had a superior airframe, performance-wise and weapon-wise, I would be supremely confident in the outcome of any engagement. But that doesn't mean the situation for Thach is hopeless. His warbird, the Wildcat, had some advantages too.
So this little tank, the Wildcat, is an easy plane to get into. It's got a great cockpit. It's got excellent defensive features out the front and out the back with the extra thick glass and the plate behind you. And it's got pretty good offensive features too with the machine guns.
Looking at the limited advantages of the Wildcat, I know what I would have done if I were the pilot of this historic warplane.
I can tell you that I would want to keep him right here so I could be shooting him, or right there so I would have this armor plate behind me that's protecting me from absorbing bullets from his plane. And I can tell you, I mean, if you know that you're slightly less maneuverable and probably not as fast, so you can't get away, and if you can't shoot him, you might as well keep him right there and jink for all you're worth to try and either run him out of bullets or run him out of gas.
Are those the only options Jimmy Thach has in trying to devise new tactics to take on the Japanese Zero? Coming up, we'll look at the Warbird's technical features to see if there's more to these fighter planes than meets the eye. Jimmy Thach will need a lot more than good tactics to survive the hellstorm at Midway. In fact, it's the proper pairing of tactics with the right plane that's among the cornerstones of success in air-to-air combat. We've already seen that the Zero is a better offensive platform than the Wildcat. But in other ways, the American fighter is actually the better plane. I'm meeting with Steve Hinton to tell us how the two warbirds measure up.
All right, Steve, so here we are with the Wildcat, and man, this thing is a tough, squat little plane. I mean, it's almost like a tank with wings.
Well, that's a good way to put it, but you know, Grumman was known for their stout and strong structures, and they called this Grumman Ironworks.
So talk to me a little about kind of the skin. I mean, it's tough. It's not like the Zero where it gives when you hit it. I mean, this is a resilient little thing.
Well, like all the American airplanes that were designed, you know, the Wildcat was built in a combat situation as overbuilt. You know, I mean, ensuring the pilot had everything he could, or as much safety as he could, so it's way overbuilt as far as structure.
This extra structure adds weight to the Wildcat, which is one of the main reasons it isn't as maneuverable as the Zero. As for the Zero, one of the more unusual ways you can tell it has a lighter structure than the US fighter is by examining its landing gear.
When I look at the gear assembly on this Zero, I mean, to me, just looking at it, it seems fairly weak.
Well, yeah, it's like a lot of the Japanese airplanes. They're really light. You know, if you look at a Hellcat or look at a Corsair, you're going to see a really strong landing gear, and the fittings and the wings are big and strong, but those are big, heavy airplanes. You know, this airplane landed on a carrier, but it touched down at about 70 miles an hour on approach, and the carrier's doing 20 miles an hour, and it's just a really light airplane, so it didn't need that big,
yeah,
heavy
so I mean,
duty
it's a little spindly, but if you have a 4,000-pound aircraft flying at 70 knots or 40 knots or whatever it is into the wind on a carrier, it probably didn't need to be too resilient.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, what are these different colors down here? The blue, yellow, and red.
That's just the ground crew could spot the different colors and know that the dimension of the strut was correct, you know, based on the loading of the aircraft.
So they can just look at it and say, if it's in the blue, it's good. If it's in the yellow, getting close, and it's in the red.
If it's a red, it needs to be serviced.
Time to recharge the struts, huh?
Exactly. Those are the shock struts right here for when you land and take off. They're like, you know, shocks on your car.
And they were like this throughout the life of the Zero. Did they change anything with the gear?
As far as I know, the landing gear seems to be the same on all the Zeros.
Needless to say, the landing gear on the Wildcat is a lot beefier.
Now, Steve, I got to tell you, this is a unique-looking gear assembly for a World War II fighter. You know, most of the ones that I've seen, the gear is up here on the wings, and this one is just right in the fuselage, and you can look all the way through the plane through the gear assembly. So what you know what went into this design philosophy?
Of course, you got to remember it's all about strength and structures. If you move the landing gear out here, you've got to build a structure that can carry all the twisting and structural loads is required. Look how long the gear would have to be. Brewster Buffalo had a gear that hinged here, and the retract mechanism was a joke. Part of being an effective weapon isn't just making the best airplane, the flying qualities. It's about how to manufacture. How do we mass produce this thing? How do we get 1,000 of these going, not just 12? They'll sacrifice a little here and there, and that's why. And it's a real simple mechanism. In the cockpit, it has the crank. You crank the gear up.
Manually crank the gear up.
Crank the gear up. It's bicycle chains and bell cranks but it's really strong the way the mechanisms go over center and they lock in position, and it's a really trouble-free design.
Simple, but it got the job done.
Absolutely.
The simple ruggedness of the Wildcat will be an important consideration for Thach when he's devising his new tactics for the plane. But besides making the Wildcat less maneuverable than the Zero, the extra structure also has some other drawbacks.
So with extra structure comes extra weight. So
exactly.
I would assume that it had a little bit less range, a little bit less of a top speed of some of the other fighters.
Yeah, the Wildcat was really our first successful monoplane, naval fighter. But they built them in large numbers, and the airplane served all through the war. It had a great record, and the guys who flew them loved them.
How about the wings themselves? The fuel is still primarily stored in here?
No, actually, the fuel's all in the fuselage.
Really?
Yeah, the fuel's right below the pilot. Carries 120 gallons of fuel there, and then on these hard points, you could hang 75-gallon external fuel to it, too. So it had a decent range. The efficient speed for this thing is pretty slow, about 130, 140 miles an hour. If you slow it way down, get the engine turning real slow, it had a pretty decent range at about 1,000 miles.
It's still not quite up to par with the Zero. I mean, the Zero was a lot lighter.
Exactly.
And carried more fuel.
Yes.
Despite some of the Wildcat's advantages, to me it still looks like the Zero has a big edge in most of the important offensive categories. But one area where the Zero doesn't have an advantage is the pilot Jimmy Thach, and his innovative thinking of aerial tactics and teamwork as the central goal to gain an advantage over the enemy.
The aircraft they were flying, the F4F Wildcat, it offered the pilot great protection, had good firepower, but you had to work together as a team. He understood the limitations of what he was flying, and he understood how to maximize its advantages, and that's what really made him a great pilot.
Thach also possesses those intangible attributes that make someone a great combat leader.
He understood the people around him, the pilots that surrounded him. He understood how to make them better. And when he was in leadership in fighter squadrons before World War II, when the new pilots came into the squadron, he would fly against them. And it would sort of be like trying to really knock off the confidence they may have in themselves after flight school, and maybe the overconfidence as he viewed it, and bring them back down to the level where he could teach them how to be the best fighter pilots that they could be.
By June of 1942, Thach is already a highly regarded squadron commander. But even before he perfects his new tactics against the Zero, the U.S. Navy is already experimenting in the same area.
Mid-1942 was a transition period for the Navy. They were flying fighters at this time, and typically in the divisions of 6 fighters. Earlier, they had formed this division with 2 sections of 3 fighters each, and they were beginning to transition to 3 sections of 2 fighters each.
This is partly because of intelligence from the air war in the European theater, where most air forces are adopting fighter formations based on pairs of fighters, that pair consisting of a leader and a single wingman. But Japanese tactics are very different.
Japanese Zeros at this time typically flew in sections of 3 fighters, or multiples of 3, 6, 9, in a flight. They'd arrange them in a V formation, and each fighter would sometimes weave around in his position so that he could look behind him better and check to make sure nobody was coming up on him from his tail.
The Japanese 3-plane section has a third more offensive firepower than a 2-plane section. But the 2-plane section has several advantages of its own.
A 2-plane formation is much more flexible and in many ways superior to a flight leader and 2 wingmen. In that 3-plane formation, it's very difficult for the 2 wingmen to not only keep formation with the leader and make sure that they don't collide with each other, but also to be looking around for enemy aircraft. They probably spend more time worrying about each other than looking around the airspace. Whereas with a 2-man formation, all that the wingman has to do is worry about covering his formation leader.
Yet even with its somewhat less adaptable formations, the Zero is still the dominant fighter in the opening months of the Pacific Campaign. Based on his assessment of the Japanese fighter, Thach knows that his Wildcats have a big problem.
And he knew that the Zero had better performance in speed, maneuverability, rate of climb, ceiling, all important factors for fighters. So the Zero had significant advantages over his own Wildcat. So he had to develop some kind of teamwork tactics to offset those individual fighter advantages.
Could teamwork be the key to defeating the Japanese warbirds? Or does Japanese technology prevail in the battle between these 2 historic fighter planes? We're recreating the epic aerial dogfight of World War II's Battle of Midway. The Japanese Zero versus the American F4F Wildcat. From what I've heard, it's pretty clear to me that the odds between the Wildcat and the Zero will need a lot of evening up. But if any pilot is up for the job, it's Jimmy Thach. A serious-minded student of aerial tactics, he pays a lot more attention to this subject than most other fighter jocks, trying his very best to master all the tactical problems he's presented with.
Thach was open-minded as far as looking at the intelligence reports that were coming into the United States Navy before the U.S. entered World War II. And he looked at those intelligence estimates and he saw the capabilities that were being presented for the Japanese Zero. And he knew the capabilities of American fighter pilots. He was in a fighter squadron in a leadership role, so he understood the quality of the pilots he had, and he understood the equipment that the United States had. So with that combination of all the information he had, he sat up late at night and trying to develop really how his aircraft could work and his pilots could work as a team to counter the natural advantages in speed and maneuverability that the Japanese pilots were going to bring to any air battle.
Speaking from personal experience, I can tell you that teamwork is central to almost everything a fighter pilot does. This is especially true with tactics, which often requires several planes and pilots working together to accomplish one mission. Being a squadron commander, Thach completely understands this. And so, well before the Midway operation is even planned, Thach starts to experiment.
He sat up late at night at his kitchen table with a box of matchsticks. And he would stay up until his wife came to remind him that he needed to go to sleep because he had to fly the next day.
He'd place the matchsticks in various formations and fly various tactics using the matchsticks so that he could visualize the relative positions of the various fighters involved.
At this point, the U.S. Navy is still using 6-plane divisions. But instead, Thach tries 3 different groupings of a 4-plane division.
One was a more standard fingertip arrangement where the fighters were arranged pretty much like the tips of the fingers of your hand and separated by maybe 100 feet or so. Another arrangement was 2 sections in trail with maybe 500 to 1,000 feet between the 2 sections. And the third arrangement that he tried was the 2 sections side by side, about 1 turn diameter, which was about 600 to 1,000 feet apart.
Each of these formations has advantages and disadvantages.
The finger 4 arrangement was pretty good for a visual lookout. Each fighter could look across the division and check the tail of the other fighters in the division. So that was good. If they were attacked head-on, however, the leaders would tend to converge to shoot at a target that was coming in head-on, so they would tend to get in each other's way. If they were attacked from the rear, it was hard to tell which airplane was being attacked, so they would all have to turn hard to defeat the attack. This was not particularly bad, but it wasn't optimal either.
Thach tries to solve the problem by putting one section of two Wildcats behind the other section.
When Thach put his two sections in trail, that solved some of his problems. Visual lookout was still reasonably good, and if they were attacked head-on, the lead section and the trail section could attack individually, wouldn't get in each other's way. If they were attacked from the rear, the lead section was well protected by the trail section. If the trail section was attacked, the lead section could come around and attack the attacker of the trail section. It had to turn a complete 180 degrees to do that, though, and it just took too long. Either the trail section would be dead or the attacker would disengage before the lead section could turn that far.
Then, Thach tries putting his two sections of Wildcats next to each other, but separated by about 1 turn diameter. In naval terminology, that's called putting the two sections abeam.
He understood that the Wildcats were going to have to work as a team. And how he envisioned it was he'd have a two-plane section, two two-plane sections, and they would be flying at a certain distance apart. And he knew that the attacking fighters were generally going to focus on one of those sections because they were so far apart it wouldn't make sense to attack them simultaneously.
When Thach put his sections abeam, it solved even more problems for him. Again, the lookout was good. Each fighter could check the 6 of the other fighters. If they were attacked head-on, it forced the attacker to choose one section or the other, and they didn't get in each other's way. One fighter section could attack head-on while the other one could attack from the beam. If the division was attacked from the rear, the section under attack could turn either hard away from the other section, and then the section not under attack could bring his guns to bear on the attacker coming in from the rear, or both sections could turn toward each other, and the section not under attack could then get a head-on shot against an attacker that was attacking the other section.
Thach quickly realizes that having both sections turn towards each other is the answer.
The concept was to let your teammates or let your wingmen or your section mates help you, and really drawing the enemy right into their line of fire.
That way they could keep each other in sight during the maneuver, and they could also reverse after the pass and make another head-on pass.
When one section attacked, that section would turn towards the other section. And what would happen was it would eventually lead the enemy into the range of the section that was not being pursued. And in that way, they could unleash their guns against the pursuing enemy. And if it didn't work on that pass, they'd keep weaving and weaving and weaving. So hence the name, the Thach weave.
Eager to test his new formation in the air, Thach enlists members of his own squadron to fly in mock dogfights. They quickly discover that the beam defense maneuver works beautifully. But that's just in practice, with Wildcats flying against each other. Will the tactic work as well against the deadly Japanese Zero and during the chaos of a real battle?
There's a lot on the line in this one, and as usual, I'll be watching it all. June 4th, 1942. Lieutenant Commander John Thach leads a flight of 6 F4F Wildcats, escorting a squadron of 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the carrier USS Yorktown. They're on a mission to attack the Japanese aircraft carriers that are striking Midway Island. Thach's division of 4 Wildcats is at 5,500 feet. That's about a mile high and about 3,000 feet above the low-flying torpedo planes. Because they're higher and faster, they're executing a series of slow S-turns in order to allow the much slower TBDs to keep up. Thach's other pair of Wildcats is flying close escort just behind the TBDs. Thach believed that he would have a total of 8 Wildcats for the mission, but only hours before launching, 2 had been held back to help beef up the Yorktown's defensive fighter screen. Since it takes a full division of 4 Wildcats to execute Thach's newly created beam defense maneuver tactic, that leaves him 2 planes short of the 2 divisions that he wanted, and Thach wasn't happy about the decision. But his squadron had been formed so hurriedly before sailing for Midway that most of the pilots flying with him hadn't been fully trained on the tactic anyway, and Thach would just have to do the best he could and trust that his boys were up for the challenge. Looks like they'll get the chance to try the new tactics soon. The Japanese carrier's outer screen of cruisers and destroyers is dead ahead. Colored bursts of anti-aircraft fire start to explode nearby. But they aren't meant to shoot down Thach's planes, only to alert the 40-plus defending Japanese Zeros that U.S. aircraft are approaching their carriers. So far, the Zeros have been deadly. Of the 29 U.S. torpedo bombers that have attacked the Japanese carriers, the Zeros have knocked down no less than 25 of them, with no damage to enemy ships. As for the U.S. dive bombers, none of them has even found the Japanese fleet yet. And here comes the Zeros, diving down on Thach's division one by one from high to the rear of the U.S. fighters. Before the Wildcat drivers even see the Zeros, they flame one in Thach's division. Now that leaves them with just 3 Wildcats. Meanwhile, another group of about 10 Zeros is going straight for the other 2 Wildcats and TVDs. It appears the Zeros are executing a circle attack pattern on the F4Fs. That's a tactic where the main force stays circling at a higher altitude, with Zeros breaking off one by one to make individual firing passes at the Wildcats below, then climbing straight back up to rejoin the circle. This permits each attacking Zero to carefully set up and execute its firing pass without worrying about getting in the way of another Zero. It also allows the Zero's commander to stay high and direct the attacks, and makes it very difficult for the Wildcats to go offensive on them. Thach tries to lead his remaining 2 Wildcats down to protect the TVDs. But they quickly come under such heavy Zero attack that Thach must put them all on the defensive. Since his number 3 pilot, Brainerd McComber, is untrained to Thach's new beam defense maneuver, Thach first tries a more standard tactic. The Wildcats stay together and turn towards the attacking Zero, trying to increase the Zero's deflection angle. As the attacking Zero nears a firing position on the trailing Wildcat, Thach then reverses the formation's turn to get a high deflection snapshot. But that Zero's attack is so closely followed by a diving attack from another Zero that Thach has to react quickly and go back on the defensive. Thach can't believe what's happening. At this point, he thinks he and the rest of his pilots will get smoked before they even test his new tactics in battle. All Thach can do is continue the trail and turn as the Zero drivers patiently and expertly continue their circle pattern attacks. The last thing Thach wanted was to get into a furball with a bunch of Zeros at low altitude. With the Zeros' greater speed and rate of climb, this allows them to totally drive the fight. And as they make pass after pass at Thach's plane, it's clear that's exactly what they're doing. But look at this. One Zero is slowing slightly during his pullout. Thach pounces on the opportunity, quickly turning his Wildcat back towards the attacker and raking him with bullets. The Zero bursts into flames. That's Thach's first kill of the battle, and he didn't even need his new tactic to get it.
Section 1 to Wingman. Section 1 to Wingman. Are you still there, Ram? Ram, are you still there?
With a slight break in the Zero attacks after Thach's kill, he has a chance to radio his wingman, Robert Ram Div.
I'm right here, boss. Listen carefully, Ram. I want you to pretend you're a section leader and move out to a beam. Way out. Once you do, I want you to initiate beam defense maneuver. Understood?
Yes, sir. I'll do my best. Unlike McComber, Div at least has some familiarity with Thach's new tactic, and he does just as he's ordered. Div slides his Wildcat away from Thach and McComber by about 300 yards. And there they go. Div begins a slow turn towards Thach and McComber. At the same time, Thach leads McComber's Wildcat in a turn towards Div. This is the first time Thach's new tactics are being attempted in a real battle. And they better work because here come the Zeros again. At this time, they're out to avenge the comet who just got splashed by Thach. June 4th, 1942. So far, the Battle of Midway has been a total disaster for the U.S. Navy. Of the 29 American torpedo bombers that have attacked the Japanese fleet, 25 have been knocked down by Zeros. Lieutenant Commander John Thach led a group of 6 F4F Wildcats, escorting 12 more TBD torpedo planes to continue the assault. But due to the beehive of Zeros, Thach has been unable to defend the TBDs. He and his 3 remaining Wildcats are now fighting for their lives against the far superior and more numerous Japanese planes. Yet Thach's division has just initiated his new beam defense maneuver. This is a tactic he devised specifically to neutralize the Zero's advantages. The maneuver calls for 2 sections of 2 planes apiece to weave back and forth, bringing an enemy plane that's attacking either section from the rear directly into the line of fire of the other approaching section of Wildcats. And the maneuver is just about to get tested. A Zero is latched right onto the 6 o'clock of Ram Dib's F4F, which is turning towards Thach and his other remaining Wildcat. Both Dibs' Wildcat and the Zero on the 6 o'clock are heading straight for Thach. Thach keeps his cool and fires a long burst at the approaching Zero, whose pilot is so focused on Dib that he doesn't even see Thach. The Zero finally tries to break away, but it's too late. It bursts into flames and rolls down. That's Thach's second kill, and the first while using his new tactic. Now the Zeros are being way more cautious. They continue their circle pattern attacks, but instead of following the Wildcats during their weaving turns, each Zero just breaks off after its firing run and climbs up to a higher altitude. Yet with the Wildcats now constantly turning, they can't get a good angle for a gun solution. Looks like Thach's new tactics are working like a charm. Another Zero dives in, but like Thach's first kill, it's slow during its pullout. Thach grabs his chance and fires. It's another victory for John Thach, his 3rd of the day. By now, Thach's Wildcats are in the thick of the main Japanese fleet. You can see that his torpedo planes are having an even rougher time than his Wildcats. In fact, 10 of the 12 TBDs end up getting down by the Japanese defenses. As Thach watches the carnage, he feels like a total failure. The whole purpose of his mission was to get the TBDs in and out safely. But even though his new tactics are working, it seems like only a matter of time before his Wildcats are overwhelmed by the swarm of Zeros. But wait a second, all the Zeros are flying off at high speed. Thach glances above him just in time to see what they're after. It's a squadron of U.S. dive bombers screaming down towards the enemy flat tops. And their bombs are plastering the Japanese carriers. Wow, what a turnaround. Up until now, Thach believed that they were losing the battle, and he was right. What he didn't know was that while the Zeros were down on the deck, pounding the torpedo planes and his Wildcats, it had left the door wide open for the U.S. dive bombers to come in at high altitude completely unopposed. The attack was not planned this way. The dive bombers were supposed to hit the carriers at the same time as the torpedo planes, but they got separated on the way to the target. And you know what? That's the fog and friction of war, and why it's so important to take advantage of unexpected opportunities. Thach and his other 2 Wildcats can now egress the area safely with little opposition. Although the cost has been heavy, in the end it's been well worth it. Before the day is out, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers will be on the bottom of the Pacific. The 4th will be sunk the next day. That Thach's new tactics have been proven in combat is just the icing on the cake. The Battle of Midway has suddenly been transformed from a crushing defeat to a smashing victory.
But like the larger Battle of Midway itself, it could very easily have gone the other way. A quick replay of some highlights from the dogfight clearly demonstrates this.
Thach had a 6-plane division of F4Fs escorting 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. The bombers were about 2,600 feet in altitude and arranged in a V formation. Thach had placed 2 fighters as close escorts, slightly behind and about 1,000 feet higher than the torpedo bombers, while he had a 4-plane section further back, about 3,000 feet higher than the bombers, as high cover. Fighters number 3 and 4 in Thach's high cover section were actually from a different squadron that were last-minute replacements for him. So they had not been trained with the Thach in the Thach weave maneuver, and probably never even heard of it.
At this point, Thach's formation is nearly overwhelmed by superior numbers. This was a do-or-die situation for Thach. He needed to make a decision quickly. It was a moral judgment: save the bombers or save himself.
The bombers and the fighters were attacked by 15 to 20 Zeros diving at them from out of the sun. Thach wanted to dive down to protect the bombers, but he was under attack himself, so his entire division had to turn hard and defend against the Zeros, and they weren't able to help defend the torpedo bombers.
During this initial attack, Thach loses one of his Wildcats to the Zeros. Before he had a chance to try his Thach weave with 4 planes, one is gone. Now he has to rely on raw instincts and make a move.
Thach's first defensive reaction with his 3 remaining fighters was to turn them hard in one direction to defend against each Japanese fighter as he dove down. They would turn hard. The Japanese Zero would tend to concentrate on the trail fighter in the division and take his shot and then zoom on up out of range again. Thach noticed this, and each time the Zero began to shoot, he would try to reverse his turn and shoot the Zero before he could get out of range. Finally, after several tries, he actually got a kill on one of the Zeros that didn't zoom up quite fast enough.
But even though he smokes a Zero this way, Thach quickly realizes that he and the rest of his Wildcats can't survive long without a change in tactics. It's now time to attempt the tactics he created on his kitchen table. He has no idea if it'll work, but he's run out of options.
So he called his number 2 fighter, Dib, on the radio, told him to move out to the beam defense position. Dib was somewhat familiar with the tactic, but was really not proficient in it yet. Thach's number 3 from another squadron had his radio shot out. He couldn't hear what was going on the radio, and he wasn't familiar with the beam defense maneuver, so he was somewhat confused. But the 2 fighters got a beam and began to weave toward each other each time one of them was attacked. Eventually, Thach was able to shoot one of the Zeros off of Dib's tail head on, and Dib was later able to shoot one off of Thach's. Thach was able to hold off superior numbers of Zeros with his 3 fighters, not lose any more fighters, and was actually able to shoot down 3 Japanese Zeros and keep them occupied for about 20 minutes. During that time, the Zeros failed to see the dive bombers well above them until the dive bombers had actually dropped their bombs. At that point, the Zeros disengaged from the fighters and began chasing the dive bombers.
So Jimmy Thach's beam defense maneuver really works, and it shows during its very first trial in battle. The key to this success is that Thach never loses his head. Even in the midst of the most ferocious combat he's ever experienced, he maintains total situational awareness at all times. And from my own experience flying in combat over Yugoslavia in 1999, I can tell you that's not an easy thing to do. He then makes a critical decision to shift to his new and untested weave tactics in the middle of the fight. This resolve, while under intense strain, probably saves not only his own life, but the lives of his 2 remaining pilots as well.
By using the beam defense maneuver, Thach was able to survive with his 3 fighters against great odds for more than 20 minutes.
Even more importantly, Thach's fighters help occupy the Zero's attention at low altitude, allowing a formation of SBD Dauntless dive bombers to approach and attack the Japanese fleet totally unopposed. The rest, as they say, is history. But not for Jimmy Thach. By 1943, his beam defense maneuver begins to be adopted by the rest of the U.S. Navy, with great success, quickly earning it the nickname the Thach Weave. Even after the Wildcat is replaced by the more capable F6F Hellcat and F4U Corsair, the Thach Weave continues to be employed as an excellent way to defend against superior numbers of enemy planes. But that's hardly the end of Thach's influence on aerial tactics.
He really helped shape fighter tactics during the remainder of the war. He actually teamed up with the studios out in Hollywood to make instructional films on how to perform the Thach weave or how to do other tactics like defending against a bombing attack or to breaking up a bomber formation. He went back to sea eventually and was on the staff of Admiral John S. McCain and developed a tactic called the Big Blue Blanket, which was to keep kamikazes from coming out to attack the fleet.
This tactic involves stationing a picket line of radar-equipped vessels around the U.S. fleet. These picket ships employ their radars to detect incoming formations of kamikazes. Then they radio the position and course of the kamikazes to American fighters circling above, which intercept the incoming Japanese aircraft long before they can attack American ships. Thach's reputation for innovation continues even after World War II, when he commands an aircraft carrier during the Korean War.
He championed the cause of close air support and the marriage between aircraft and the troops they were supporting on the ground, and then became an expert in the Navy on anti-submarine warfare and how aircraft could defeat enemy submarines, in the case of the Cold War, Soviet submarines. And he ended up retiring as a 4-star admiral.
In 1981, Admiral Thach passes away quietly at the age of 76. But his mark on U.S. naval aviation is deep and enduring. Not only does his Thach weave save countless numbers of U.S. aircraft and pilots during World War II, but it continues to be used long after the war is over. And to this day, the John S. Thach Award is still given to the top carrier-based anti-submarine warfare squadron in the U.S. fleet. And to think, it all started with matchsticks on a kitchen table.
In many ways, the pilots who devise aerial tactics are just as important as the engineers who design and build the planes. John Thach clearly demonstrated that with his famous Thach weave during his dogfight at the Battle of Midway. By allowing the U.S. Navy's F4F Wildcat to fight on more equal terms with the Japanese Zero, the Thach weave proved that not only teamwork is essential to victory, but also that superior tactics can neutralize the technical advantage of an enemy aircraft. Even more amazingly, while slightly modified, his tactic is still in use today. I'm Major Paul Moga. I'll see you next time on Showdown Air Combat.